the other big takeaway, ironically, as there was a stablecoin conference out here in New York, was
stablecoins.
Stablecoins.
From stablecoin.
That's right. Big theme, per usual, as always, up until maybe perhaps when we move through the stablecoin bill vote, is stablecoins. Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios here in New York City, coming off the heels of the big Bitcoin 2025 conference in Vegas. We're just getting back from that in a week that was a lot to recap there and a lot to recap on the charts, as one big whale trader is tweeting about some interesting things. Honestly, a very interesting kind of shakeout there between the cabal and the anti-cabal that may be forming around some liquidations and a call to action among those in the crypto community. Things are getting spicy out there. And of course, also one of the biggest and most hyped IPOs in crypto for the last few years, Circle, raising more money and its price target for shares in where they will list potentially later this week. All eyes on that for the same day that a key House hearing is gearing up for the 4th as well. So we'll bring a little bit of a recap to this show as well as a look ahead, because this is starting to get into a very interesting crypto summer. It's not altcoin summer, clearly, if you look at the charts. And maybe that's where we kick off this show, because an interesting kind of ETH BTC battle, perhaps because the most interesting thing to come out of the Bitcoin conference in Vegas was really just corporate treasury speak. We're going to play a little clip of what we heard from Michael Saylor later on in the show, but the charts are telling a very interesting story to kick us off today, as we see Bitcoin hovering around that 104K mark, down considerably from just a few days ago when we were back at those all-time highs of 110. And I think we had this chart from last week, Texas, the ETH BTC chart. I think it's always interesting to kind of think about the mix of where we're at right now and how ETH has shot higher to that trend line, just to think about where it is holding above that $25,000 level here. Of course, ETH has seen better days if you zoom out on the chart, just in terms of relative trading levels. Texas, we want to come back out here, still holding that $25,000 level, which I think is important to note and important to investigate as we move forward throughout the week, because I don't know, it's kind of at that make or break level where it's kind of flirting with, hey, does it actually want to challenge Bitcoin right now for the flows and the intention of where we go in this market? And, you know, that's the one, obviously, where if we get back to these levels, it's going to be a totally different story, I think, in that battle. Obviously, to those December levels around 4K. But it's going to take a pretty serious stringing together a couple different weeks here, I think, for ETH to finally show that it is above that trend line that we've been watching. Because right now, it's just kind of like, which side does it want to be on? And if it breaks through, decidedly so, I think you're looking at a pretty good run back up to those levels. Of course, that's what Sean Farrell's been telling us for a while. And TBD. We're going to dig into a little bit of that, because obviously now Joe Lubin, one of the ETH founders, is also leading a treasury company as well, as he's invested into one of those publicly traded companies scooping up ETH. We're going to talk about that for Bitcoin and Solana. So that is definitively the trend, and where things go from here, nobody necessarily knows, but important to keep an eye on that trend line as we move forward. Want to recap. By the way, if you're watching this and you like what we're going to be talking about, go ahead and throw a like on it, retweet it, blah, 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 whatever that is. We do better when more people watch and you co-own Coinage with us. So go ahead and share what we're talking about here. And perhaps, by the way, perhaps that big whale trader we talked about, James Wynn, maybe he'll just hop in here, because we're all in the trenches this week on crypto Twitter. Anyways, want to dig into what we saw in the field out at Bitcoin Vegas, Bitcoin 2025 this past week, because it's a pretty crazy time out there. And, you know, always interesting to kind of see how these conferences are put together. No one is the same as the next. Certainly a different vibe than what we saw at Solana's conference just the week before out here in New York. And that was mostly because, you know, David Bailey and the Bitcoin Inc. team, BTC Inc. team, the rest of everybody who's putting on conferencing out there, it's, you know, it's a different vibe. Keep in mind, this is the same team that kind of pushed for Trump to come out and speak at Bitcoin Nashville. That was an election year one of the things that surprised, I think, a lot of people on the ground, certainly not just me when I was talking to other people around there, is generally just the vibe of how many mega fans made it out to hear Don Jr., Eric Trump, the rest of the bunch, basically talking about Bitcoin. You heard a price target thrown out there too from the likes of Eric Trump and Don Jr. That was maybe one of the weirder parts of the conference. But obviously they're very bullish. The rest of the Trump family, very bullish, including President Trump. And just interesting to kind of see some of the I guess, art, if you want to call it that, at the conference as well. People wearing mega jackets, people wearing Donald Trump jackets, Donald Trump art on display at Bitcoin 2025 as well. But of course, if you've been to one of these conferences recently, you know that's not why people are there. They're not necessarily there to hear Don Jr. or Eric Trump, but they are there to hear Michael Saylor. And of course, if you think about how his kind of stage presence, his whole kind of being has grown by virtue of just buying and holding Bitcoin through strategy, I'm not going to say it's not deserved. Look, people care about what Michael Saylor has to say. I will say, however, it was interesting to hear kind of where we've landed. And this is the part of the show where we talk about Bitcoin treasuries and specifically why I think Bitcoin 2025 was weird outside of the mega stuff. Was weird just because how much of it has become, hey, we are buying Bitcoin and holding it, but we're a company. And that was kind of Saylor's main point. I wouldn't say it's his only point in this keynote, but basically that's the way the conference wrapped. Was everyone standing there waiting to hear Saylor as the last person to speak, wrapped up the thing, and that was that. And I'm standing there, I'm watching this all, standing room only per usual for Michael Saylor. We're just going to play a little part of his keynote, which was essentially, look, this is how the capitalism works. The most important and powerful companies are the largest in the trading markets, public trading markets here in New York, in the US, and that's where you want to get to. You can start as a little shrimp, you can start as an individual, you could be part of a family, or you could be one of these large publicly trading companies. And we're just going to play a part of that of his speech here because I'll let you decide how interesting this message is at a Bitcoin conference. Take a listen.
The individual is at the bottom of the hierarchy. The family is more powerful. The partnership is more powerful still. The small, mid-sized private business is more powerful still. The large private company is next. The small public company on an OTC market is next. Then a public company on a large capital market, then a public company on NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange. Then there's the seasoned issuer in the US capital markets. And at the very top of the pyramid is the well-known seasoned issuer in the US capital markets. There's a few hundred of them in the world. What can you do when you crawl to the top of that pyramid? You can file a registration statement and sell $1 billion of securities in 6 hours.
Now, it is true. I mean, you can do that. And of course, I think Michael Saylor is very proud of the way that he's been able to use the public markets as a publicly traded company at Strategy. And again, I'm not taking anything away from it. Obviously, a lot that he's accomplished at Strategy. And, you know, even back when it was mostly just still the tech company that it once was, even before it started doing anything Bitcoin related. And so I'm not taking anything away from Saylor. I just really do think that the programming there did get interesting because, you know, it's cool when you're the only person doing it. I'm not saying it's not cool, too, when you're also kind of convincing other people to start doing what you've done because it's worked. Where things get less cool is if that's all that the narrative becomes. Is, hey, anyone can kind of buy this, hold it, and eventually maybe enjoy some of the success that Strategy has enjoyed, but not to the same scale. Because then it's kind of like less interesting because it's not as big. And unfortunately, I think a lot of these projects only then start to get interesting because they will fail in a drastic way. And that won't be good for price, and that won't be good for particularly, I think, the shareholders in those companies. And that's where we're going to go after this. But I do think it is interesting because it's not just Saylor who understands public markets because he's played this game and he knows the ups and the downs and how to get around it and how to leverage some of this stuff, which is why there's Strategy and then there's everything else. And what we heard a lot of at Bitcoin 2025 was in that everything else bucket, which includes the Champions League champions, PSG, also up there on stage talking about why they too are now a Bitcoin treasury player and why they are building alongside everybody else in the Bitcoin community. Just want to play a little bit about what we heard from PSG also jumping into the fish tank, as it were.
We put Bitcoin in our books. So we took our fiat reserve and we actually allocated Bitcoin. We still have it in our books. And as one of the largest clubs in the world, we're the largest player in the sports ecosystem to kind of do that.
So they're one of the largest players in the Bitcoin world now, I suppose, at least when you combine all the fanhood of PSG and them riding high on the Champions League win, which, by the way, terrible game from what I'm told. I don't know, Texas, you were watching it. I wasn't going to watch a 5-0 rout. Not good if you ask me. But PSG, Bitcoin team now, I guess, supposedly. And everyone else also in the mix, too. I mean, this is not just my take, but also shout out to the recap in the block as well. Yogita, as she always, I think, is always noted, one of the longest running editorial members over there at the block. But it seems to be the theme that everyone's waking up to this is, can everyone really run a Bitcoin treasury and do it as well as Saylor, or is going to have anywhere near the success of how this has gone? And also, what does it look like when things flip and we're not at 104 or 110 or anything near that? How many of these companies are going to get this wrong? How many of these companies are going to blow up? What's going to happen to PSG if things don't go well? And that is where things start to get interesting, because it's not even just Bitcoin anymore when it comes to these treasury companies. It's also now spilling over into Solana, which is an interesting kind of combination of what we saw at the Solana conference, what was discussed, and also what we saw discussed, as you just saw, at the Bitcoin conference. And if all of these things are just, hey, we're going to find publicly traded companies and we're going to scoop up the respective crypto asset and we're going to issue shares, I think it's fair to say we may have arrived at the point in crypto where we have to ask ourselves, what the fuck are we doing here? And I think that's a good question to ask. And it's also in line with the long-term bet as to why Coinage exists the way we do outside of public markets, but actually as a community-owned show, as a US DAO co-op, which sits outside of the normal securities route. And look, I think certainly Saylor's right in the sense that these things do scale. There is a lot of reason to assume that these things can grow larger when you're dealing with a publicly traded company that can issue shares and can raise billions of dollars in seconds, as he describes. At the same time, I'm fairly certain that crypto was always established to be something that sat outside of all of the traditional finance norms. And we're going to get into it a little bit because, again, we're going to have a huge billion-dollar IPO from Circle and the idea of that stablecoin company raising more money than they had expected to. And so, again, no one's wrong in saying that going that route is certainly going to have you raise a lot of money. But I do think from the side of community ownership and what crypto stands for, it's leaving a lot to be desired. And certainly when we see things play out the way that I think a lot of people in crypto certainly understand it's going to play out that way. When you hear Saylor talking about some of these things at a Bitcoin conference, I at least feel the same way that I did, and I'm sure you do, when you had Sam talking about why DeFi wasn't as good as centralized stuff. There's just red flags that go off sometimes when people are talking about things that do not match some of the cult messaging that has come through the brainwaves before. And if it doesn't match, you too should probably be standing up on your toes and asking yourselves, why is that? And I don't know, always very interesting. Now, that is not to say that things won't work out in the short term, and I think we've had some pretty good interviews. If you haven't watched them yet, we'll play another clip because we did sit down with one of the Solana publicly traded Solana Treasury strategy companies looking to do what Saylor's doing with Bitcoin, but just using Solana. And again, the TAM is large. We chatted with Cosmo Zhang at Pantera about why he put, I believe it's on the order of like $50 million or something like that, into DeFi Dev Corp, one of the Solana treasury plays. And he just kind of outlined the way to think about pairing what Strategy's doing with Bitcoin and what DeFi Dev Corp's doing with Solana, and why all these treasury companies are popping up. Take a listen to what he told us.
I think that's exactly the right analogy. When I think about as an investor, what I'm trying to find is big open growth stories and like how big can this get if it succeeds. And so you look at Bitcoin today, 2 trillion market cap, you look at MicroStrategy, $100 billion market cap, and so call it 5%, right, of Bitcoin. Well, if you translate that over to Solana, Solana's 100 billion, 5% of that's 5 billion. That sounds like a pretty big TAM to me.
So reaching a $5 billion company, just doing that, I mean, I think it's pretty reasonable, right? If you think about how Strategy's been able to do it, if you're the first mover advantage, you're able to do it, you're able to suck in all this capital, more efficient way to play it, especially for Solana, by the way, before there's an ETF. Then yeah, a lot of this does make sense. And I think it's going to be exciting to see which one wins and how quickly it gets there and the size of these things, no doubt about it. I then also think about what the end goal in for what crypto is trying to do and ownership and democratizing things. And certainly if you can buy stocks, then this all works out. I do just think it's interesting to think about. We're going to find out this year what core principles people in crypto actually do appreciate. Whether it is kind of what ETH's trying to do, and I guess the market's speaking for itself right now, or if it's, the idea of just getting as large as you can, as quick as you can. And I'm not saying one way is right, I'm not saying one way is wrong, but this is why we're seeing this trend continue to accelerate. And the interesting thing, I think, in doing that, and why I think, again, there's Saylor and then there's everybody else, is because he's been able to sell everybody on the idea that he's never going to sell his Bitcoin. It's I'm going to keep on to this, and I'm never going to dump it. You never sell the Bitcoin. And he's sticking to his book. And obviously, if that ever changes, that's going to be another big red flag in terms of, whoa, Saylor's talking about selling his Bitcoin. And I don't know. In terms of liquidations, you never really technically need to sell. These things are always complicated. We're going to get into that in a second. But it was interesting to hear the COO at DeFi Dev Corp talk about that in our interview that we'll be publishing this week with Matt Siegel from Van Eck, where he was basically asked in our own interview when we were just chatting if he's going to be the Michael Saylor of Bitcoin, if he'll come out and say, I'm never going to sell, and if you need that type of conviction to actually have this all go well. That was an interesting piece of our longer interview, which you can find on our YouTube later this week. But just want to play a little bit of that because I do think that is the core of how their strategy, Saylor, and everybody else. Take a listen to this.
Can I throw in a question?
By all means, yeah,
for Parker.
For sure.
Like, Saylor famously, promises not to sell his Bitcoin. But if your North Star really is Bitcoin per share or Solana per share, then in the bear market, if your stock's at a discount, like it might make sense to buy back stock and sell Solana. Would you differentiate your strategy versus that never sell one?
Certainly, given that our North Star and all executive and non-executive bonuses are tied to Solana per share growth, we're pretty highly incentivized to, do buybacks. There's some situations where maybe it wouldn't make sense, and at a very small short-term discount, maybe it doesn't make sense, but if it gets deep enough, I think we'd have to take a pretty serious look at returning value to shareholders.
I think that's kind of interesting about kind of where we're at, right? GameStop just executed the same exact strategy that Michael Saylor seems like he sold Ryan Cohen on, and that trend continues. And some of those shares haven't been performing. They're not enjoying kind of the same boost that we've seen Strategy enjoy. And again, I think it's piece into the conviction of, hey, is this a company that's just buying Bitcoin, or is it a company that is throwing its full weight into this strategy and into kind of buying into the Bitcoin ethos and showing up, showing out, and will never sell? And it's a big question, I think, about what those shareholders actually want. And I think it's the biggest thing that's overlooked when it comes to this, because economists don't have any way of really measuring it in terms of cult conviction. And the idea of, are you buying and holding something because you actually want to hold it and believe in the mission? Or are you just buying and holding something because, hey, it moved up 10% now? That was my investment strategy, now I want to sell it. And I think those are two very different things. And I think that's where one of these things will work and won't because of your GameStop, and it's not really core to your mission or your core to your thesis, like Saylor's and strategies. Then it all kind of falls apart when shit hits the fan. And we've seen that time and time again. And true also, by the way, in crypto as well. Which is why I think if you look at the Solana chart right now, very interesting to think about kind of, again, the core mission there of NASDAQ at the speed of light, or trading internet capital markets at the speed of light. Whatever it is, people building in that ecosystem have a shared ethos. Same thing with ETH. There's a shared ethos over there. And I think we're going to find out how big some of these conviction holders are in terms of, as this stuff moves forward, do they want to sell when things move higher? How strongly held are their convictions when things move lower? And ETH's kind of at that level right now, by the way. As a community-owned show that has most of our treasury in ETH, we're also in that bucket as well. And so I do think that kind of having these shared missions will become more and more important. It's never difficult when we're in the boom times. It's always in the crypto winter times where you find out who your friends are. But outside of that, perhaps a good segue into one of those guys who's finding things out about where his friends are as well. We haven't had a main character, by the way, outside of Saylor in crypto since, I think this is fair to say, since the downfall of Doe and SBF. There haven't been too many main characters that are actually intriguing. And James Wynn, don't know if that's his real name, seriously doubt that it is. These are kind of some interesting stories that we've been following when it comes to a hyperliquid trader who a lot of people on crypto Twitter have been paying attention to, mostly because his trades have gotten super big with leverage in terms of not just how big they are from a size, but also how much money he's up, he's down. This guy's up like hundreds of millions of dollars and then down 40s, 50s millions of dollars, and then he's completely wiped out. Dude's everywhere. And so everyone's been following his trades. And I think this one is pretty interesting because it went from just kind of being like, hey, I'm trading these things. And then all of a sudden it went into, hey, all this stuff is manipulated and you need to join me. And that's kind of where these tweets started going as people realized, like, okay, this guy's trading in size. And we can see all of it. And his liquidation price is getting, close. Then he's liquidated. And then he says, I'm going to run this back. And now we're getting into the territory of, okay, he is back and he's down again. And then on top of that, there was, hey, he's down again, but come join me. And those come join me tweets are very interesting and reminiscent a little bit of basically what we saw with Roaring Kitty in the GameStop days. Is like, hey, can I rally enough people around this who believe alongside me that these markets are manipulated and that all of these exchanges are also basically waiting and targeting liquidation events to maximum extract all the crypto that people are trading on these platforms. And I think that that is a very interesting narrative to start to play with. And so I don't know if you're watching this, if you're out there, James, a very interesting kind of way for this all to come together, because very similar, again, to what we do here at Coinage with our kind of idea of bringing together people who can rise and fall together, in that we are all riding and basically tying our boat to the Coinage DAO. And this is just interesting because essentially that's what we're seeing from James Wynn now in this tweet. Is, he's opened these positions. He's basically trying to hold. He's trading around this 103 level, 104 level, perhaps partially the reason we're seeing maybe some of this move around. But tweeting out, if you want to fight the market-making cabal and support me, send USDC to this address. By the way, do I need to even say this? Never do this. I mean, you're free to do with whatever you want to do, but it was interesting to see Zach XBT throw in here as well with the whole idea of I trust you. And the Coinage thesis here is don't trust anybody, obviously. We're a community-owned DAO. You don't need to trust me or whatever. Gabriel Haynes reacting as well, fellow Coinage member. But it's interesting because I think a lot of people feel similarly in terms of how the markets are stacked against them, how a lot of the major players, market makers are stacked against them. And so to have someone, or perhaps an entity, shared trading positions, to have some voice or some face in the market right now that is trying to unify voices or people out there who feel the same, very interesting to see, because it's not a small trader. This is a large whale who has put on some large trades and does have kind of the size, but nonetheless is asking for contributions from everybody else in the ecosystem. So a little weird to see, but we'll keep our eyes on that one and see how things go there. I want to kind of go full circle with the show as we wrap up this Monday's show with more of what we heard from Bitcoin 2025. Because if it wasn't that vein that we heard from Saylor and the like of Treasury is the new way that anything in crypto is going to get done. Publicly traded companies who have crypto treasuries. The other big takeaway, ironically, as there was a stablecoin conference out here in New York, was Texas. What else did we hear?
Stablecoins.
Stablecoins.
From stablecoin, stablecoin, stablecoin,
Stablecoins.
Stablecoin.
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 Stablecoin. Stablecoin for Bitcoin. Stablecoins. Stablecoin. 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 Stablecoin.
Stablecoin.
That's right. Big theme, per usual, as always, up until maybe perhaps when we move through the stablecoin bill vote, is stablecoins. And it was still very much the case out in Bitcoin 2025 in Vegas. And interestingly, I think the big story in stablecoins, there's two of them right now, something to look forward to later this week, of course. Our interview with French Hill will be publishing as well, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. Going to be having a huge hearing, adding pressure to getting the Genius stablecoin bill across the finish line. That vote in the Senate could happen at some point. No one really knows when, but I will tell you who is capitalizing on all of that is Circle, because we brought you this last week. We were looking at their S1 filing here, basically highlighting how many shares they expected to sell, what they expected to see, pricing 24 to 26 per share, and also targeting, as we highlighted back then, $6.7 billion valuation. Well, this week, what we get is that is being upsized to a $7.2 billion valuation as they see outsized interest in this IPO. So clearly, not just at the conference out in Las Vegas where people are talking about stablecoins, but the general market as well, as you're seeing Circle see outsized interest and move up the targeted range per share to $27 to $28 per share. We may see that begin trading. I think it's on June 4th, so the same day as the big House hearing in the House Financial Services Committee. So all this stuff coming together at the right time for Circle, and they're clearly riding that wave well. But from a broader perspective, I think it is interesting because it's one of the first kind of huge IPOs we've seen in a while when it comes to crypto. And it's always interesting to just kind of get it like a gut check. In fact, I ran into Reeve, one of the co-founders of Tether, on the ground at the Bitcoin conference. And even he's kind of intrigued by kind of how this one goes, because everyone in crypto is just sitting there watching and saying, how much, to Saylor's point, how much of the broader market actually respects the size of what's actually going to happen? And if you think about maybe, by the way, some of the expectations around whether or not the stablecoin bill passes, we're going to have huge moves, I think, in how Congress is thinking about this, which then impacts the way that the Circle IPO goes, which then impacts, I think, the rest of the crypto market. People seem to be sleeping on why those things are connected or why it even matters. But Texas, if we look at the chart, kind of some weird moves in expectations for a stablecoin bill getting passed. Even just, what was this, a couple of days ago? May 30th? So just the end of May. 69% chance. Interesting. Coming up here to an 88% chance. So a pretty big swing. And even though not too many headlines around all this. So steady as she goes, I think, around all this, despite what you may hear from James Wynn and him getting liquidated and how much money he needs sent to him in his USDC address. I think a lot of this is still steady as she goes. And we will bring you that House hearing on June 4th on Wednesday. I think it's going to be an interesting one just to think about what we heard from French Hill and why he's hosting that one. And the co-founder of Ethereum's big kind of marketing arm, I guess. I don't know if I should say marketing arm, but their whole team around trying to get people to use Ethereum is going to be speaking of that one too. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a very interesting week as this all shapes up. Per usual, as always, Coinage will be covering the big headlines around the world of Web3. You can always go to coinage.media to check out our aggregated recaps of what the hell's going on, other people's reporting, trusted crypto content that you can co-own with us by heading to coinage.media and minting a membership pass as well. Caucus Network passes let you co-own this with me, with everybody else here at Coinage, along with the co-founder of Netflix and the rest of our community. As always, thank you again for joining us. We'll see you again soon.